So when we use the Desmos graphing calculator, it's not going to automatically be on the page. They now have you taking the OGT on a computer, and when you're using that computer, you have to open the calculator. They will have a button you hit. I don't have access to how that's going to look, but there'll just be a button you hit to open the calculator. And when you do, something like this will pop up. It'll probably look a little different. Let me make it big. It'll look a little more like this, where the stuff is on the side, the graphing parts and to the right, and then you can show the keypad here at the bottom. I was trying to make it so you could see the whole thing, the question and the calculator, so it looks a little smushed right now. So depending on the problem depends on what we need to do with the graphing calculator. So this problem says, what is the value of the expression AB squared divided by C if A equals 1/2, B equals -4, and C equals 3/4? So when it gives a question like that, the easiest option will be to use the graphing calculator. So when they give us these letters, which are called variables, a, b squared, c, so all the letters are variables, this time they're actually giving us numbers to plug in. They told us what each letter really means as its number version. So when we see the letter B, we would use -4. When we see the letter C, we would use 3 divided by 4. So we want to rewrite this using the numbers they said to use, since they gave us numbers. So instead of the letter A here, we're going to use the number 1/2. Now the A is touching the B, but it doesn't actually show any math symbols in between. It doesn't say A plus B squared or A minus B squared. When you have two letters touching each other, the math symbol that's actually in between them is a times symbol. And when I do that little dot, that means times now. In the past, you've seen it as a little X. Most of the time now we do it as a dot, because now that we're using letters, having the little X makes it look like a letter. So this A next to this B is really multiply. And we need to know that because we have to multiply the 1/2 times whatever comes next. So what number are we going to use instead of the letter B? Instead of writing B, what number did they tell us to plug in there? And you can just say or type your answer into the chat area. What number should we use for the letter B? Good, -4. Correct. So instead of the letter B, we're going to use the -4. Anytime you have an exponent, that little tiny number that's up above, it's kind of special. So when you replace numbers that have an exponent attached to them, you have to write in your own parentheses. They're not going to have that written in. So you have to put the parentheses in yourself because it was an exponent. Then we have divided by, and C would be the 3/4. So underneath we have 3 divided by 4. So now this is kind of a tough one to type into the Desmos calculator. We want to type in the fraction 1/2. So on the calculator, there's no actual fraction button, but we can figure out the fraction by using a divide symbol. The divide actually turns it into the fraction itself. So when we want to type 1/2, we just type 1 divided by 2. And then instead of using the dot, they do have on the calculator the X symbol. So, okay. So see there, I made a mistake. I went and hit times right away. This calculator can be a little picky, but if you see that happen, say, oh, that's not where I want the times. I wanted it to the side of the fraction. So I'm going to erase it. So if you have something on the bottom already, you have to click to the side to get it not in the denominator of that fraction anymore. And I should have done that first, but it's an easy fix. I just erased it. Now I hit times, now that I'm next to the fraction. So now we do the parenthesis, -4 squared. So the parentheses are over here on this part of the keypad. And there is no specific negative symbol. Some calculators you may have used in the past, you would have a minus symbol and then a separate negative symbol. This calculator, you use the minus symbol for everything. So even though this means subtract, it can also count as negative. So -4 in parentheses. And then this a squared gives you the exponent of 2. Now we need division again. We need to make it a big fraction, but this fraction bar is touching everything on top. If we highlight everything and hit divide again, it changes it into one big fraction. And then we can put the 3 divided by 4, which again, even though it shows as a fraction, we hit the divide button. So I'm going to make this big so that we can see the whole thing at once. So when you type that whole thing in and it looks exactly as we had it written, it gives you this answer in this gray box in the bottom right-hand corner of box 1. So 10.6666667. Technically, this would be 0.666 forever. The calculator has to stop at some point, so it rounded that last 6 up to a 7. So when we look for our answer, none of the answers have that decimal. But that's okay because we can still figure out which answer matches. Only one of the answers has the same starting value. We have 10 point, all those decimals. So we want to pick the one that starts with a 10. The decimals, the 0.66, would be the fraction part of all these mixed numbers. So only one answer choice starts with 10, and that's our answer choice C. So even though it didn't match exactly, this question is still a lot easier to do by getting that decimal answer. It can be pretty hard to do using just the fractions. And in fact, if you don't want to type in the fractions at the beginning, if you're like, I don't really want to figure out how to type in 1/2 and 3/4, you could have instead gotten decimals for them. Say, well, 1 divided by 2, that is 0.5. And if you wanted to do a second line, so you could see them both at once, 3 divided by 4 is 0.75. We could have used that instead. We could have done 0.5 times -4 squared divided by 0.75, and you'd get the same answer. So just another option. And as we go through, if you have any questions while I'm talking about stuff, just type your question into the chat box and I'll be happy to answer. Okay. So this next question involves, you can see this scientific notation here. So the circumference of the Earth at the equator is approximately 24,900 miles. Which value expresses length of the circumference in scientific notation? So this one you could use with a calculator, or you might be comfortable enough with scientific notation to just figure it out. So if you are comfortable with scientific notation, you know that the decimal should always be behind the first digit. We want it to be behind the 2. So we have to figure out, so that's where we want it to end. That's where we want the decimal here. But that's not where the decimal currently is. if there's no decimal written on a number, it's assumed to be at the very end. Oops. So you basically just count. How many spaces would you count over? How many digits before you get to the place we want the decimal at? How many digits did we move that decimal place over? Okay, so you answered 5, and you're close. When you're making those counts, the first spot doesn't count. This is actually 0. We don't say 1 until we've done a movement, so that's 1 move over, 2 moves over, 3 moves over, 4 moves over. So it's a slight distinction, and depending on how you count it, you either get 4 or 5. If you just count, oh, dot, 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 there's 5 dots. We want the actual movement for our counting. So we say 4 moves versus 5 dots. So that would give us this answer choice C. But let's say you forgot how to do scientific notation, or you just want to check your answer with the calculator. Instead of looking at it that way, you could take your answer choices and plug each of them in to see if it comes out as the correct answer, 24,900. So to type this scientific notation in, you do the 2.4 times 10 to the second. Okay, we'll start with the 10 to the second. I'm going to make this big again. You do the 2.49. You hit the times button, which in this case is the X. Most of the time we try and use the dot, and it shows up as a dot up in the calculator, even though the button we hit is the X symbol. It's a little confusing because it goes back and forth all the time. So 2.49 times 10, and then you're raising it to the second. Now we have a button that's a squared. That'll automatically get us to the second. But we look at our answer, that's 249, and we wanted 24,900. So the answer we wanted was 24,900. We tried answer choice A, it didn't work. So now we're going to type in answer choice B and see if this works. So we type in to box 2, or if you just want to get rid of it, if you're like, well, I know answer choice A didn't work, you can hit X and it just gets rid of it completely. I usually like to keep all the answers I've tried with as much space as I have. You know, if it gets too cluttered, I cross them out. But if I'm working on one problem, it helps me to look back and forth. So the next one is 2.49 times 10 to the third. So 2.49, we hit the times button, and even though here it's an X, it's going to show us the dot, 10, and this time we don't have an A3 button. We do have an AB button. So squared comes up a lot. They gave it its own special button. Anything higher than 2 doesn't come up as often. So they said, well, this button can be used for any exponent. If you want it to be to the third, it's to the third. If you want it to be to the fourth, it's the fourth. So you hit the AB button and it changed it. So now it's up above. And now we type the 3 and it gives us our answer, which is close but not quite right. We needed 2 zeros, and so far we only have 1. So now we tried 2.49. This was answer choice C. I'll write it out just so we can see it on the same page. Times 10 to the fourth. So now we go through and type that in. 2.49 times, we hit the X for the times, 10, and then we use the AB button again. You have to use that AB button to get any other exponent besides a 2. So 2.49 times 10 to the 4th. And I keep wanting to hit the equal sign. You keep probably seeing my mouse move down there, but it automatically shows the answer. You don't have to hit equals. And now we have the matching answer. So we know our answer choice is C because we tried plugging them all into the calculator. And it doesn't hurt. Again, if you're ever confused, just want an extra set of confirmation, type in the last one. We can type in D and make sure it's not the answer. It was 10 to the 5th this time. And we see, oh, that's an extra 0. You have plenty of time on the OGTs, so any extra help you might want by checking things on a calculator is good to try out. So this one, we'll need the calculator a little bit, but not a whole lot. Sylvia practices piano for 17 hours in a 2-week period. So those two pieces of information are kind of grouped together. They said this many hours in this 2-week period. And it's important to know what information kind of corresponds to each other, because usually we're going to have to group them together at some point. So how many hours does she practice in 5 weeks? So how many hours, when they ask that question, usually that's where we have a variable. I'm going to say H for hours. That's what we're going to look for, is the number of hours. And we're just going to call it H so that we can write math equations with it. So how many hours does she practice in 5 weeks? So those two pieces of information are kind of grouped together. So a problem like this, where you're giving two sets of information that are kind of grouped together, but they're both hours and weeks. They both have similar pieces of information. You want to set up something called a proportion. So a proportion has an equal sign and it has two fractions, one on either side. So I made a big deal about what was grouped together because that's what makes up your fraction. So 17 hours in a 2-week period, we're going to have the 17 hours with our 2-week period. That makes up one fraction. This was our group 1 set of information. The other fraction is going to be our group 2 set of information. But we have two options. We have H and 5, so either this is H over 5 or it's 5 over H. So we have to figure out which way do I write this, and it's important how we write it because otherwise we might get the incorrect answer. So when we write it, we have to write it in the same order we wrote the first group. 17 was the number of hours, which means on the top of our fraction, we're going to have to write the number of hours. 2 was the number of weeks, which means the bottom of the fraction also has to be weeks. It has to go in that same order. So should our fraction for group 2 be H over 5, or should our fraction for group 2 be 5 over H? Which one of those does the hours over the weeks? Good. H over 5. H stood for hours, so we know that's hours, and then 5, they told us, was the weeks. So I write in that this is hours and weeks just so we could talk about it. When we do the math, it's easier if that information isn't there, if we just have 17 over 2 equals H over 5. So when we solve this, we do something called cross multiplication. The bottom of the second fraction is going to multiply by the top of the first. It's always coming from the bottom to the top of the other side. And then the 2 will multiply over by the h. Now we do the actual multiplication. And you could do it by hand, but it's easier to make mistakes if you do it by hand. I would just type into the calculator 17 times 5, which is 85. So when you have an equation, to get a variable alone, you have to do the opposite math operation. This is the number 2 multiplied by the letter h. We want to do the opposite of multiplication and divide by 2. When you do the opposite, it gets rid of that number that we're doing the opposite of. So we just have an h, and now we have to plug into our calculator 85 divided by 2. Which gives us 42.5. So 5 weeks gives you 42.5 hours. Now, some problems you're going to have to set up a proportion for. It just would be too complicated. This one, you might have been able to just kind of logic your way through the problem. Sometimes you don't have to set up a whole math equation. You can say, well, 17 hours in 2 weeks, if we're jumping up to 5 weeks, that's more than double. It's over twice. Double would be 4 weeks, so it's a little over double. So we have to be a little over double of 17. So you might have just thought it through that way and said, well, 17 times 2, that's 34. I've got to be above that, and there's only one answer choice above that. So that's another possible way to just kind of logic your way through a problem. That does work. You don't always have to go to this full-on set up an equation. But it's good to practice these because some of them you have to do a full-on set up an equation. I'm going to make this a little bigger because we can't see the whole question. Okay, approximately 1 out of 14 people have hazel eyes. If the world's population is about 7.2 billion, estimate how many people have hazel eyes. So this is the same kind of setup. I put up a similar question where you're going to have to set up a proportion. So we always do that, figure out what information is grouped together, and then we decide how to write the first fraction. And from that first fraction, then we have to write the second fraction in the correct order. So we have 1 out of 14 people have hazel eyes, which means 1 person has hazel out of 14 random people or total people. So how should we set up our first fraction? What numbers should go for our first fraction? I don't see an answer yet, so I'm going to move forward. I'll keep looking for it, though. So for the first fraction, as long as you group your information together, it actually doesn't matter. We could do 1 over 14, or we could do 14 over 1. I'm going to pick 1 over 14, just so it's in the same order. So if the world's population is 7.2 7.2 billion. So that's everyone in the world. It's not only the people with hazel eyes, it's all the people. So estimate how many people have hazel eyes. I'm going to say P for people. So since it was one person with hazel eyes out of every 14 total people, we have to actually put our variable on top. If we pick 1/14, 1 is our hazel, and we're trying to find hazel eyes. So our variable on top, 7.2 billion on the bottom. So we have to know how to write a billion out. So 7.2, the decimal is actually a comma if we're going to write it out as one big number. And then we just keep adding zeros until we're up to 7.2 billion. So right now this would be 7,200. If we did 3 more, that would be 7,200,000. So we have to do it one more time. That's 7,200,000,000. Because all the answers are in millions, so you might not be able to figure out which one is correct unless you write this out as billions first. So then we cross multiply to solve. 1 times the 7,200,000,000 and 14 times the P. Now lucky for us, if we multiply by 1, that doesn't actually change anything. 1 times 7,200,000 is 7 billion. Oops, sorry, I said that wrong. 7,200,000,000. It's easy to forget the correct way to say a long number like that. And then we finish by dividing, because the opposite of multiply is to divide. So now we've got to go type this into our calculator. 7,200,000,000. Now they don't have commas. Oh, actually, no, it does. We're going to try this out. I don't know if this will work or not, but it will help us keep it more organized. It's easy to lose track of how many zeros, but the commas can help with that. Divided by, nope, the commas did not work. So you're just going to have to keep track of your zeros. 7,200. So I always type it in groups of 3. I say, okay, well, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. That way I can keep track of them in groups of 3 at a time. Divided by the 14 is, let's see, so groups of 3 again to figure out where we are in the millions. 1, 2, 3, that's the hundreds, so 714. 1, 2, 3, that's the thousands, so 285,000. So it's 514 million. Because they have 51 million and 514 million, it might be easy to confuse the two. So you want to really focus on those groups of 3, because every group of 3 tells you if you're in your hundreds, thousands, millions, or billions. Millions and billions. So now we have a percentage problem. So again, a calculator on this one is just going to be 100% necessary. We must have a calculator with these percentages. So Kim has a coupon for 30% off one item at her favorite store. She picks a skirt for $43. How much will Kim pay if she gets 30% off and then pays a 6% sales tax? So with percentages, after you figure out the percent, you're either going to have to add it on to the original number or subtract. So first we have to figure out how much is taken off, which is subtraction. So after we figure out the percentage, we're going to have to do that extra step of subtracting. So we need to figure out, well, how much is 30% of 43? So you can do this two ways. This calculator has some fancy features. So you could actually go to this functions button and go to miscellaneous, and there's a percent button. So it says percent of. You can literally just type in 30% of 43 and it'll pop it out for you. But again, it's easy to forget new things. You're not as comfortable with this calculator. The other option is to change your percent to a decimal. 30% as a decimal is 0.30. We figure that out by moving the decimal over 2 spaces, or by doing 30 divided by 100, because every percentage is out of 100. 100% is the most you can have. So that times the 43 will give us the same answer as if we use the percent button on the calculator. So 0.30 times 43 gives us that same answer of 12.9. Two different ways, again, to find the same thing. So you get $12.90 off of 43. We have to do that subtraction now. So 43 minus 12.9 is 30.1. I'm going to double check that with the calculator. 43 minus 12.9 is 30.1. Okay, so that's not the final answer. Always check if you have the final answer. Sometimes they'll try and trick you, especially if it's multiple choice, and they'll give an answer that you would get halfway through the process, but really you have to keep going to find the next answer. So how much will Kim pay if she gets her 30% off, which we did, and then pays a 6% sales tax? So pays implies addition. So we've got to figure out 6% of this 30.1. So again, we're going to use our calculator. You can do it the old school way that you can use with any calculator, or we can go to this functions button. If it's not on miscellaneous, it might start out on this trig, but you would click over on miscellaneous and pick the percentage. I usually pick that first and then just click to the beginning and type in the percent because I forget which order it's going to show up in. So 6% of 30.1 is 1.806. Now we are working with money. When you're working with money, you only use 2 decimal places. So we have to decide, is this going to stay 1.80? Or is it going to round the 0 up to a 1? There's our 2 options. And the number next to it is what tells us the correct option. If this is a 5 or bigger, then you round up. If it's a 4 or smaller, so if it's 0 through 4, it would stay 80. So 1.81 is the correct rounding, and we're adding it to the 30.1. Because it is a sales tax, that's the extra money we pay to whatever state you're living in for taxes. So 30.1.91 is the final answer. So if this were a free response question where you have to type in your work, I'm not exactly sure of the exact format I assume you'll just type in the steps you do. So because they've switched it to computer, you can't just write out your work. You're going to have to type it in probably. So you would say, I found 30% of 43, which is 12.9, then subtracted that from 43 to get 30.1. Because usually with these free response, you have to explain your process. Then I figured out 6% of 30.1, which is 1.81, and added it to 30.1 to get the final answer of $31.91. It doesn't have to be exactly like this. This is just one way. Sorry, I keep trying to hit the decimal and hitting something else. Okay, 31.91. You might not need a full explanation. Look for how it states it in the question. Maybe you just need to say, Kim pays $31.91. That might be enough, depending on how they state it. Some questions say, explain all your steps. This would be an explain all your steps answer. If this one just asks you what the answer is, you could just need to say, Kim pays this much. Oh, let me get rid of all this writing. Okay, so this is going to be our last question for today. Sheila is going to invest $5,000. So when you invest money, you're trying to let someone use your money to make more money on like the stock market or using a bank. First option to invest is a stock that pays an annual dividend of $3.75. So they are assuming you know that annual means you get that amount every year. So this is saying you get $375 every single year. They could use a word like semi-annual. Semi-annual is twice a year. Quarterly is 4 times a year. So they will use words like that they're assuming you know the definition of. Her second option to invest in is a bond that gives her an annual interest rate of 7.5%. So annual again, but this time you calculate it using interest. But you are being given that money, so this is an add percentage. How much money will she have after 3 years for both options? Identify which option is going to make her the most money. So option 1 is easier to calculate. She starts with $5,000 and just gets $375 every year for 3 years. So we just need to add the 375 3 times. Again, you could do that by hand if you want to. It's easier to just go over to the calculator. 5,000 plus 375. Good, 1125 is correct. Well, 375 plus 375 plus 375 is 1125, 1,125. And then you also add that to the 5,000. You still have your initial amount of 5,000. So total is 6,125. You have to do the 5,000 plus the 1,125. So that one was easier to calculate because it was just the same number every time. The 7.5% you're going to have to do over and over again. We have to calculate it one at a time. So we need to find 7.5% of 5,000. You can either use that Desmos calculator feature, or you can move your decimal 2 to the left, which means you have a blank spot and have to do 0.075. So how much do we get if we're finding 7.5% of 5,000? What number should we get for that first percentage? And we're taking 7.5% of that 5,000, or we're doing 0.075 times the 5,000. Both of them get us our percentage. So this one is again 375. Doesn't have to be. They probably made it work that way just to be a little more confusing. But we can't add it separately. With percentages, we have to get each year individually and then find another percentage. So after the first year, we're going to end up with $5,375. So the second year, we're starting with that amount, and we've got to figure out a new percentage. We're going to have to do our percentage again, but with our new number. We're going to use that percentage button one more time. 5375 this time, and now notice it's different. We get 403.125. Is that going to round up or is it going to stay the same? Should we use 403.12 or 403.13? So it's either going to stay a 2 or go up to a 3. 0.13. Good. The 5 next to it rounds it up. So 403.13, and then we add the two numbers. I'm going to add them before we go back, just because we're on our calculator. 5375 plus 403.13. Oops. And so I hit the equal sign sometimes because you're used to hitting equals on a calculator, and it took my answer away. Just backspace, say, oh, I messed up, erase that, and it'll show the answer. So 5778.13. 5778.13. So now we have to do it one more time. It was for 3 years. So on the third year, we start with the 5778.13. Then we have to figure out our percentage again. So this Desmos graphing calculator, I think I forgot to mention, you can get to. You can either go to this www.desmos.com, or there's an app on any smartphone, so you can download it as an app. I recommend going to it and practicing some problems using this graphing calculator, because it's really helpful to know how to use this when you're taking the test. So I'm going to use the percent button again, and we want 7.5% still, but this time of the 5778, yep, 0.13, and now it's gone up, and we have to decide again, do we round or not? Should this be 3.5 or 3.6? Do we keep it a 5 or do we round up to the 6? We round up to the 6. Good. So now we have to add again. with interest, you're earning money, we add every time. So 5778.13 plus 433.36 is 6211.49. So now we have to make our conclusion. Option 1, we ended up with the 6,125. Option 2, we ended up with $6,211.49, which is our better option. Option 1 or option 2? Which one makes the most money? Option 2. Good. So again, how can you get some points if you've forgotten some of this? If you're like, I don't remember how to do these percentages. Well, you could still write out option 1. Option 1 was easier. Figuring out the amount for option 1 will probably give you, usually they're worth 2 to 4 points. So if this question was worth 2 points, you'd probably get 1 just for figuring out option 1. So still do what you can do on these free response type questions because you can still get some points at least. Option 2, if you forget how to do it, you could also remember that interest and exponential functions, they usually get you money much quicker than adding. You might still get some points by saying, I know option 2 will make me more money because it's using a percentage. Sorry, I had my hands on the wrong spot. I know option 2 will make more money because of the percent. So even if you forgot how to calculate it out, if you're confident, I know this would be more money, I'd still write it in. Can't hurt to say, I think I know what's happening. I don't remember how to actually calculate the interest though. So thanks for coming today. Next Wednesday, we'll have another session. I will let you know the time a day or two beforehand again. It kind of varies. We share this account that allows us to have these group sessions, so I have to change my time depending on what other teachers have signed up for. But it'll be around the same time, either like 4:35 or 6-ish at the latest. So I'll let you know when that is, and thanks for coming today, and hopefully I'll see you again next week.